There is a serious misunderstanding many people carry about empathetic individuals. They believe soft people are weak people. They assume patience means passivity. They confuse forgiveness with surrender. They mistake emotional kindness for emotional blindness. But what most people never come to realize is this simple truth. Empaths are not fragile just because they feel things deeply. They are incredibly strong because they endure things that would emotionally break most people. And the moment you push an empath past their emotional limit, something shifts permanently. Not loudly, not dramatically, and not all at once, but quietly, coldly, and for good. Because the most dangerous version of an empath isn't the emotional one, it's the emotionally detached one. You see, empathetic people study human behavior constantly. Even when they stay quiet, they are noticing everything around them. They pick up on subtle tone changes, shifts in energy, fake concern, forced affection, hidden disrespect, and manipulation dressed up as love. They catch what others miss because high emotional intelligence trains the brain to spot inconsistencies. That's why so many empaths stay silent longer than people expect. Not because they don't see what's happening, but because they are quietly gathering emotional proof. Most people assume an empath keeps forgiving because they're naive. That's completely wrong. Empaths often understand the truth long before they ever bring it up. They simply hope people will choose honesty before the consequences become impossible to undo. But repeated emotional pain reshapes human psychology, especially for someone who feels everything so intensely. At first, an empath will try to talk things through. They'll explain how they see it. They'll try to repair the connection. They'll ask thoughtful questions. They'll search for real understanding because emotionally intelligent people naturally look for solutions before they choose to walk away. But when empathy keeps getting met with manipulation, the brain starts adapting purely for survival. This is where the real transformation begins. Slowly, the empath stops reacting emotionally. And most people completely misread this stage. They tell themselves the person is finally calming down or letting go. But there's a huge psychological difference between emotional peace and emotional shutdown. Peace still holds warmth inside it. Shutdown holds distance. And once emotional detachment sets in, the relationship has already entered its final stage. Human connection survives entirely on emotional investment. The moment the empath stops investing emotionally, the whole structure quietly collapses. What makes this so dangerous is that a lot of manipulators only feel powerful when they can trigger a strong reaction. They feed off emotional access, arguments, begging, crying, explaining, and defending. These reactions reassure them that they still control the emotional atmosphere. But when the empath suddenly turns calm, something unsettling happens on a psychological level. Control disappears completely. The manipulator can no longer predict how they'll react, and that unpredictability creates deep anxiety in them. That's why emotionally harmful people often turn more aggressive once an empath goes quiet. Silence takes away their influence entirely. This is a key psychological principle to understand. People grow deeply uncomfortable the moment their emotional control over someone else disappears. And empaths eventually reach a point where they stop seeking validation from the very people hurting them. That single shift changes everything because emotionally detached empathy is incredibly hard to manipulate. Now understand this clearly. Empaths don't turn heartless after going through pain. They simply become more selective. That's the real difference. Pain teaches you to recognize patterns. After enough betrayal, the empath stops brushing past obvious red flags. They stop over-explaining themselves to people who won't listen anyway. They stop chasing closure. They stop forcing connection. They stop trying to rescue people who genuinely enjoy causing harm. And this shift catches everyone around them off guard. Why does this happen? Because people grow dependent on the emotional safety that empaths naturally offer. Empaths listen closely, support consistently, forgive again and again, and understand on a deep level. Most people never grasp the true worth of that emotional presence until it's completely gone. And once it disappears, the emotional environment shifts right away. Suddenly, the warmth is missing. The steady reassurance is missing. The deep emotional availability is missing, and many people go through a kind of psychological withdrawal without even understanding why it's happening to them. They were living off emotional energy they never truly valued. This is why breaking an empath so often leads to deep regret later. It's not because the empath wants revenge, but because their absence reveals what their presence had been shielding people from the whole time. It reveals loneliness, emotional confusion, a lack of real understanding, and a hollow feeling inside. The empath had been carrying heavy emotional weight quietly the entire time. And once they set it down, everyone finally feels just how heavy it really was. There's another mistake people often make. They believe emotional people can't become emotionally disciplined. Actually, it's usually the opposite. The deepest feelers eventually become the sharpest observers, because pain sharpens awareness. An empath who survives betrayal builds remarkable emotional control. Over time, they learn who drains their energy, who plays on sympathy, who lies through charm, and who performs kindness as a strategy. And once these patterns become clear, the empath becomes very hard to fool ever again. This is where emotional maturity turns into real emotional power. It's not loud or theatrical power, but controlled power. It's the kind of power that no longer needs anyone's approval, the kind that can walk away without a long explanation, and the kind that understands silence can be far stronger than confrontation. That's why emotionally evolved empaths become intimidating to manipulative people. Manipulation only works on those who are desperate for emotional connection. A healed empath is no longer emotionally desperate. They can love deeply without ever losing themselves in the process. And that changes everything. Now, here's the part most people are simply not ready for. When an empath finally stops caring, it usually means they cared far too much for far too long. Emotional shutdown rarely happens out of nowhere. It comes after repeated disappointment, repeated disrespect, repeated imbalance, and repeated betrayal. Eventually, the nervous system protects itself by sharply pulling back emotional attachment. Psychologists refer to this as emotional withdrawal following prolonged stress exposure. And once this state fully sets in, reconnecting becomes extremely difficult because the empath remembers everything on an emotional level. They don't just remember the words, they remember the patterns, the energy, and the behavior over time. Trust that's been broken again and again doesn't rebuild easily. This is why so many people panic after losing an empath from their life. They assume they can always win them back later down the line. But emotionally detached empaths often never truly come back on the inside. Even if they return physically for a while, emotionally they're already gone. And that realization brings a regret far heavier than anger ever could. People often overlook true value while it's right there in front of them. It's only absence that brings full clarity. This message isn't meant to scare you, it's meant to bring awareness. People need to understand that empathetic individuals are not emotional tools built for endless sacrifice. They are human beings with real emotional limits. And the more emotionally intelligent an empath becomes, the less patience they have for manipulation dressed up as love. So if you have someone in your life who loves deeply, listens sincerely, supports you consistently, and stays patient through your worst moments, don't take that for granted. Emotional safety is extremely rare, and once it's destroyed, it's almost impossible to rebuild it artificially. An empath can easily live without the people who hurt them, but many people can never truly recover from losing someone who genuinely understood them. That is the ultimate irony. The empath everyone underestimated becomes the one person they can never replace. And by the time they figure that out, the empath has already moved on emotionally with their life. Most people completely misunderstand what actually happens inside an empath when they get hurt, because the internal damage rarely shows up right away. An empath doesn't instantly turn cold, distant, or angry. In fact, at first, they often become even more patient, more understanding, and more emotionally present because their natural instinct is to repair emotional tension rather than stir it up. That's exactly what makes this situation so psychologically dangerous. While other people react instantly to a perceived betrayal, empaths quietly absorb the emotional pain and process it internally. They replay past conversations in their head, notice subtle shifts in behavior, pick up on emotional inconsistencies, and try to convince themselves that things can still get better with time. They give repeated chances not because they're weak, but because they understand human imperfection on a level most people never will. But every single disappointment leaves a lasting mark. Every ignored feeling, every act of manipulation dressed as love, every moment of emotional disrespect slowly wears down the nervous system. Over time, the empath starts experiencing deep emotional fatigue, a painful state where the mind grows utterly tired of carrying everyone else's emotional weight while getting little to no emotional safety in return. This is the critical stage that most people completely fail to notice because on the surface, the empath still looks perfectly calm. They keep communicating normally. They still show up to help the people around them, and they still try their best to keep the peace. But underneath, something important is shifting. The emotional energy that once flowed naturally into the relationship starts steadily fading. Their trust becomes far more guarded. Their emotional openness gets carefully protected. Their mind slowly and deliberately moves from attachment into observation. Instead of chasing a broken connection emotionally, they start studying the growing distance instead. This inner shift matters a lot to understand because emotionally intelligent people don't disconnect on impulse or out of anger. They pull away only after going through prolonged psychological disappointment. Once the empath realizes their natural kindness is being repeatedly taken advantage of instead of genuinely valued, the brain starts adapting purely for self-protection. They stop explaining themselves over and over to people who won't listen. They stop reacting emotionally to every single issue that comes up. They stop begging for honesty from people who already know exactly what damage they're causing. At this point, many people wrongly assume the empath has just gotten emotionally stronger for the sake of the relationship, when really the empath is quietly preparing to survive without it altogether. The silence feels noticeably different. The energy feels noticeably different. The emotional warmth that once filled every interaction slowly and quietly fades away. This is exactly why people so often realize an empath's true value far too late. They get so used to receiving endless emotional support, patient listening, deep understanding, and repeated forgiveness that they start mistaking it for something permanent. They wrongly assume the empath will always stay emotionally available no matter how much pain they're put through. But that's simply not how human psychology works. Even the most compassionate mind eventually hits a point of total emotional exhaustion. And once an empath reaches that absolute limit, the detachment that follows is extremely hard to reverse because it was built slowly through emotional pain piling up over time. By the time the empath finally lets go, they've already spent months or even years quietly grieving the relationship in silence. That's why their final distance feels so calm, so controlled, and so permanent. Because the emotional goodbye happened inside them long before the physical separation ever became visible to anyone else. One of the biggest psychological mistakes people make is assuming that empathy automatically means weakness. A lot of people wrongly believe that because someone is patient, forgiving, emotionally open, or deeply understanding, they can be manipulated endlessly without any real consequences. They assume kindness means emotional dependency, and they mistake genuine compassion for a total lack of awareness. But emotionally intelligent people operate very differently from what most manipulators expect. Empaths are constantly picking up on subtle emotional patterns. Even during moments when they seem completely silent or emotionally calm, they notice small shifts in tone, inconsistencies in behavior, passive disrespect, emotional dishonesty, and manipulation carefully hidden under fake affection. The real reason many empaths put up with unhealthy behavior longer than others isn't because they don't see it, but because they naturally look for emotional explanations before making final judgments. They try to understand someone's pain instead of immediately condemning it. They attempt honest conversation before choosing to walk away completely. But repeated emotional manipulation changes the core psychological dynamic entirely. When someone keeps lying, controlling, gaslighting, neglecting, or actively taking advantage of an empath's compassion, the empath slowly starts to realize that their emotional energy isn't building a real connection anymore, it's just feeding dysfunction. This single realization becomes a massive turning point. Instead of reacting harder or louder, the empath starts withdrawing emotionally. And this is the exact moment manipulation starts to completely fail. Manipulative behavior survives entirely on emotional access. It relies heavily on triggering specific reactions like fear, guilt, confusion, constant over-explaining, or emotional chasing. The manipulator only feels truly powerful when they can control someone else's emotional state at will. But once the empath stops reacting the way they're expected to, the manipulator completely loses psychological control. That sudden, unexpected calm often throws people off because they mistake silence for weakness or submission, when really, that silence has turned into genuine emotional detachment. The empath is no longer fighting endlessly to be understood because they've already started understanding the situation clearly on their own. Their whole focus shifts from trying to save the relationship to protecting their own peace of mind. This psychological shift is incredibly powerful because emotionally detached people become almost impossible to control. The empath no longer seeks constant reassurance, no longer argues endlessly for basic honesty, and no longer gives up their emotional peace just to hold on to unhealthy connections.